Welcome. Today we're preparing for an extensive exploration of one of Australia's most enduring cold cases. I'm talking about the disappearance and ultimately the murder conviction of Lynette Dawson.
It's a case that has captivated and frankly horrified people for decades.
Absolutely. And our focus today is to really analyze the source material we have. It gives us a very comprehensive summary of the timeline, the initial failures of the investigation, and then the really dramatic legal proceedings that finally brought this to a conclusion.
After nearly 40 years. It's an incredible span of time.
It is. So our goal is clear. We want to synthesize this incredibly complex and challenging timeline for you. We need to go beyond just the surface level facts.
Right, we need to understand the connections.
Exactly. The connections between the personal lives of, well, the victim and the perpetrator, the crucial investigative hurdles that stalled justice for so long, and then I think most importantly, the specific meticulous legal reasoning that finally secured a murder conviction in 2022.
And this is key. A conviction where the victim's body was never found. That's a huge legal mountain to climb.
It is. But before we get into unpacking all of that, it is absolutely essential that we center the profound tragedy of this case.
We have to.
We are talking about Lynette Joy Dawson, born Lynette Sims, who vanished in January of 1982. She was a mother, she was a daughter, a sister. She left behind two very young daughters and a family whose loss has just spanned more than 40 years now.
So we're approaching the subject with the utmost sensitivity and respect for that enduring suffering and for the family's relentless pursuit of the truth.
That sensitivity is paramount because the timeline here is just, it's stark and it's emotionally challenging to go through.
It is. So Lynette Dawson, as you said, disappeared on or about the 8th of January, 1982. Her husband, Chris Dawson, who was a former professional rugby league footballer, he remained under suspicion for years, decades really.
But it was just suspicion for so long.
For so long. And the legal system finally secured accountability nearly 4 decades later. He was convicted of her murder on August 30th, 2022.
And the sentence.
The judicial outcome was a 24-year jail sentence with a non-parole period of 18 years.
So if you just step back and look at this purely from a chronological perspective, that time gap, nearly 40 years between the crime and the conviction, it's staggering.
It is staggering.
Yeah.
And that duration immediately signals the extraordinary difficulty that is inherent in solving and successfully prosecuting these kinds of long-standing cold cases.
Especially, as you said, ones that are dependent entirely on circumstantial evidence.
Exactly. There's no smoking gun. There's just a long, complicated chain of events.
So to really understand the motive and the context of what happened in 1982, we have to look closely at the domestic environment that the Dawsons were living in.
It all starts there.
It does. Lynette Sims and Chris Dawson met very young. It was 1965 at a high school function. They were both just 16 years old.
And they married 5 years later in 1970. They settled down in a place called Bayview in Sydney, and they started a family, raising their 2 daughters there.
And those early years of their marriage, they were complicated by Chris's public profile.
He was a sports figure.
He was. Both Chris and his identical twin brother, Paul Dawson, played professional rugby league for the Newtown Jets. This was between 1972 and 1976.
And that shared professional sporting background, it created a dynamic in their home life that was unusually exposed to the public.
Yeah.
And we see clear evidence of that exposure in the source material.
Yeah, what's particularly insightful is the fact that their very unique family situation wasn't kept private at all.
No, not at all. In 1975, the Dawson brothers and their wives appeared on a documentary program for the ABC called Checkerboard.
And the whole segment was about them.
The entire segment, yes.
Yeah.
It was dedicated to exploring how the twins' exceptionally tight shared bond, it's described as an almost symbiotic relationship, how that affected their individual marriages and their personal lives.
Yeah. Analyzing that historical context is so critical. It suggests a domestic environment where the conventional boundaries of a marriage were already being challenged by this really intense sibling identity.
That's a good way to put it. This twin relationship becomes a sort of recurring, if subtle, factor in everything that follows, all the allegations, all the events. It really points to a family structure that was already operating under a lot of stress long before Lynette's disappearance.
And so after their time in professional sports, both Chris and Paul, they transitioned. They moved into the field of physical education.
Right, they became PE teachers.
Chris took up a teaching position at Cromer High School, which is near Sydney, and it's really here that the domestic narrative takes a profoundly disturbing turn.
Because his professional life and his personal life are about to overlap in a catastrophic way.
Catastrophic is the right word. The source material contains extremely serious allegations that speak directly to, well, the character of the perpetrator, and they establish the critical motive for the crime.
And what are those allegations?
It alleges that both Chris and Paul regularly engaged in illicit sexual behavior with female students at their respective schools.
And the sources go even further. They explicitly allege that Chris Dawson was one of 6 male teachers at Cromer High School who exploited, or, to use the source's word, preyed on students.
It's important to be really clear here. We're reporting precisely what the source documentation outlines regarding these accusations. We're maintaining the required impartiality.
Absolutely. But these allegations, they establish a clear pattern of boundary violation, a pattern of abusing a power imbalance. And that provides crucial context for the core relationship that the prosecution argued drove the entire crime.
And this brings us directly to Joanne Curtis.
Joanne Curtis, a student at Cromer High School. This is the relationship the prosecutors would later argue was the sole motive for murder.
So what happened?
In 1981, Chris Dawson groomed and then began a sexual relationship with Curtis. She was still a minor at the time, and she was his student.
And this illicit affair, it wasn't just some secret thing happening on the side. It quickly began to displace Lynette from her own home.
Right. I think the timeline of that replacement is one of the most chilling parts of this whole story.
It is. In 1981, Chris invited Joanne Curtis to temporarily move into the family home in Bayview.
While Lynette was still living there.
While Lynette was still there, this wasn't a clandestine meeting somewhere. This was an open, sustained disruption to Lynette's marriage, to her family's stability, right there in her own house.
It's an incredible violation.
The final moments before Lynette vanished are marked by this. The sense of normalcy. It's a profound contrast to the chaos that was about to unfold.
What was her last known contact?
Lynette made her last known contact with her mother. It was a phone call on January 8th, 1982. They spoke, and Lynette confirmed plans to meet her mother and other family members the very next day, January 9th, at the Northbridge Baths.
A meeting she never attended.
She never arrived.
And here is the fact that really forms the bedrock of the prosecution's entire case when it comes to intent and opportunity. It's the speed of the replacement.
It's immediate.
It's immediate. Just 2 days after Lynette's last known contact with her mother, on January 10th, 1982, Joanne Curtis permanently moved into the Dawson residence.
So within 48 hours of that planned meeting at the Baths, the domestic environment shifted completely. Curtis took Lynette's place in the house, in the family unit, in the bed.
That speed is astonishing, and it naturally raises so much suspicion. But perhaps the most telling initial action from Chris Dawson was the delay in reporting his wife missing.
He didn't notify authorities for 6 weeks.
6 weeks. That gap provided a significant window of time, a window that was later leveraged by the defense to argue she had just left, and by the prosecution to argue he needed time to cover up a crime.
And when he finally did go to the police, he offered these conflicting and, as we now know, fabricated accounts of her departure.
War stories.
He claimed to the police that she had left because of marital problems. He specifically cited issues over her spending on her bank card.
So he's blaming her.
He is. And in other versions of the story, he suggested she had abandoned her family to join a religious organization.
2 very different narratives.
Exactly. These early conflicting stories seem designed to establish one idea, that Lynette left voluntarily and unexpectedly.
And his actions in the years immediately following her disappearance, they just further cemented the view that he had no expectation, and certainly no intention, of Lynette ever returning.
That's right. Despite her official status as a missing person, he initiated and then finalized divorce proceedings against Lynette in 1983.
And then, right after the divorce was finalized, he married Joanne Curtis. That was the very next year, 1984.
So that sequence of events, the swift replacement, the delayed reporting, the conflicting stories, and then the formalization of the new relationship, that really formed the foundation of the prosecution's circumstantial case decades later.
It did. The domestic environment was fundamentally restructured immediately. It suggests a premeditated plan, not a grieving husband waiting for his missing wife to come home.
Okay, so let's move to the investigation itself. The immediate aftermath of the missing person report saw investigations initiated by the New South Wales Police, but the challenges they were immediate and they were immense.
Immense. And primarily because you have no body, you have no crime scene, and you have no confession. the initial efforts were, looking back, completely inconclusive.
We know, for example, that Sydney police did engage in some pretty intense search efforts. The sources mention them hand-digging the property at the Dawson home back in 1982.
But without any definitive evidence of a crime, the case just, it stalled. It went cold.
And that lack of resolution, combined with this mounting suspicion from her family, that led to the legal necessity of conducting coronial inquiries years later.
Years and years later.
The first of these judicial reviews didn't happen until nearly 2 decades after Lynette vanished. The first inquest was held in February 2001, and it was led by Deputy State Coroner Jan Stevenson.
And the findings of this inquiry were a huge step forward.
A powerful step, yes. Coroner Stevenson's determination was unambiguous. She found that Lynette had been murdered.
And not just murdered.
No. Crucially, she concluded that the killer was someone she knew, which effectively ruled out a random external act of violence. This finding led the coroner to take the necessary legal step of recommending that criminal charges be laid.
Okay, and here's where we hit the first and maybe the most critical legal roadblock that prolonged this case for decades. The coroner recommended charges, but Nicholas Cowdery QC, who was the NSW Director of Public Prosecutions, the DPP, he assessed the available evidence, and he refused to prosecute.
And it's so important to understand why. Why would that happen?
Well, a coroner's inquest operates on a standard of probable cause. They're trying to determine how and when a person died. The DCP, on the other hand, has to assess whether the evidence meets a much, much higher standard required for a criminal trial.
And that is?
Proving guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. So in 2001, Cowdery concluded that the lack of a body, combined with the difficulties in challenging Dawson's story about her leaving, meant they just couldn't guarantee a conviction.
So the evidence, even though it was strongly suggestive of murder, was deemed insufficient to meet that very high prosecutorial threshold.
Exactly. So despite a judicial finding of murder and a recommendation for charges, the case just stalled again.
But the search for truth was, thankfully, relentless. Just 2 years later, a second inquest was convened. This is in February 2003, and this time it was led by State Coroner Karl Milovanovich.
And the findings of this second inquest were even more direct.
Much more targeted, yes. Coroner Milovanovich not only found that Lynette had been murdered, but he explicitly recommended that Chris Dawson be charged with her murder.
So now you have two separate coroners, looking at all the facts over a 2-year period, and they've both reached the exact same fundamental conclusion.
And yet, the legal blockade held firm.
Nicholas Cowdery QC again refused to prosecute Dawson. He just reiterated the core concern, the lack of evidence necessary to meet the criminal standard of proof. The case was effectively shelved. Again.
And that must have been a period of just intense frustration for Lynette's family and for everyone who suspected foul play.
This gap from 2003 until the next major legal action, which was over a decade later, it demonstrates the immense power of that criminal standard of proof, especially in nobody cases.
It's the whole ballgame.
It is. Without a body, without forensic evidence, without a confession, the prosecution is relying entirely on circumstantial evidence. And the legal system, back then, determined that that chain of evidence was just too weak to guarantee a jury would convict. And that created this massive, frustrating time lag.
So the inertia that had gripped this case for, over 15 years, it finally broke. And it broke because of a completely unexpected catalyst.
Not from the police, not from the courts.
No, from the power of non-traditional media and public interest. This came in the form of a 16-part Australian crime podcast series, The Teacher's Pet, which was released in 2018.
A game changer in every sense of the word.
Absolutely. This series, which was spearheaded by the journalist Hedley Thomas, it didn't just report on the case, it drove it back into the public sphere with just unprecedented force.
The show generated massive public interest. I mean, the numbers are incredible. It accumulated close to 30 million downloads worldwide.
That level of saturation, it transformed the case from a cold file that was sitting on a shelf somewhere into a global conversation. And that applied immense pressure on law enforcement to finally act.
But the significance of the podcast wasn't just the fame it got. It was the quality of the investigative work it presented.
That's a crucial point.
Our sources indicate that the podcast systematically presented a huge amount of evidence. This included interviews with witnesses who had never been fully interrogated or whose information hadn't been centrally, put together by police investigators up to that point.
So the media platform, it really succeeded where decades of police work had stalled. And it was because it was able to use narrative tension and public outreach to locate new witnesses, to re-interview old ones.
And to package that whole circumstantial chain in a really compelling and exhaustive way. It effectively created a new, compelling brief of evidence for the police to work with.
So following this intense, media-driven investigation, the legal wheels finally started turning again, and turning rapidly. In April of 2018, the NSW police formally requested the Office of the DPP to review its brief of evidence,
Which now included all the new material and leads generated by the media attention.
and this action culminated in Chris Dawson's arrest. He was arrested in Queensland in December 2018.
And he was subsequently extradited back to New South Wales and formally charged with the murder of Lynette, a moment that was nearly 37 years in the making.
And alongside that murder accusation, he faced another very significant charge.
Yes, a charge of carnal knowledge with a girl between the ages of 10 and 17.
And this charge related directly to his sexual relationship with Joanne Curtis while she was a student and he was a teacher at Cromer High School.
And even though it's a separate crime, that charge was so important because it underscored the abusive nature of the very relationship that provided the essential motive for removing Lynette.
Dawson was granted bail. He pleaded not guilty to the murder in June 2019, and by February 2020, he was committed to stand trial. But the journey to the courtroom was severely complicated by the very factor that reignited the case in the first place.
The massive publicity.
The massive publicity. And this leads us to this critical legal procedural battle that almost stopped the trial from ever happening.
Chris Dawson's attempts to have the case stayed, permanently halted.
Yes. His defense raised two powerful legal arguments that had to be addressed by the highest courts in the country.
What was the first one?
The first argument centered on the inordinate delay in prosecution. The defense contended that after nearly 4 decades, the delay unfairly prejudiced his ability to receive a fair trial.
Because witnesses' memories fade.
Exactly. Witnesses' memories fade, defense evidence degrades, documents that might be necessary for his defense could have been destroyed or lost over all that time.
And that's a legally sound argument in many jurisdictions. A fair trial requires the defendant to be able to mount an adequate defense. But the second argument was really unique to this case.
It was. The defense claimed that the pervasive and overwhelming popularity of the teacher's pet meant there was a significant risk that any potential jury pool would have already prejudged his guilt.
That the public was already contaminated, so to speak.
Precisely. And the courts took these arguments very seriously. A temporary stay was initially granted by Justice Elizabeth Fullerton specifically, and I'm quoting here, to allow publicity to fade from jurors' minds. So they acknowledged the risk.
But the defense was pushing for a permanent stay, a total halt of the criminal proceedings.
And that was denied by the NSW Supreme Court.
And this ruling was upheld by the Court of Criminal Appeal. Undeterred, Dawson's legal team pushed the matter all the way to the highest judicial level in the country.
But in April 2022, he was denied special leave to appeal to the High Court of Australia. So the High Court, in essence, affirmed that despite the intense media coverage and the long delay, the state still had a legal right to prosecute the case.
So the path to trial was finally clear. But the defense had one more move.
A pivotal procedural change. In May of 2022, they successfully applied for a judge-alone trial.
And that application was granted by Justice Robert Beach Jones, who agreed with the defense's argument that, again quoting, the extensive pretrial publicity meant a jury was unsuitable in his case.
And that decision to have a judge-alone trial, it was a direct, very pragmatic acknowledgement of the media's profound influence on this case.
Absolutely. The judicial system basically concluded that the only way to guarantee a fair assessment of this incredibly complex circumstantial evidence, free from the ingrained narrative that had been established by the podcast and other media, was to rely solely on the legal impartiality of a professional judge.
And that set the stage for the definitive hearing.
Okay, so the trial. It was conducted before Justice Ian Harrison in the NSW Supreme Court. It began on May 9th, 2022, and it ran for an intense 10 weeks, concluding on July 11th.
And because, as we've said, there was no body, no weapon, and no confession, the proceedings were really a forensic masterclass in building and defending a purely circumstantial case.
So the prosecution's case, It relied on constructing this irrefutable chain of motive and opportunity.
Their primary argument was centered on Chris Dawson's obsessive desire for an unfettered relationship with Joanne Curtis.
Unfettered meaning without any obstacles.
Exactly. And Lynette was presented as the immovable obstacle. The prosecution argued that the only way for him to achieve the life he wanted, which included marrying his young student, was to remove his wife permanently.
And that speed with which Curtis moved into the family home? That became a key piece of evidence illustrating his intent.
It did. Now, the defense, they adopted a very focused counter-strategy. They conceded that Chris Dawson had acted poorly.
They admitted he may have failed his wife morally.
Morally, yes, but they legally maintained that he was not a murderer. Their whole argument was that Lynette had left and abandoned the family to create a new life somewhere else.
And to support this abandonment hypothesis, the defense called several witnesses who claimed to have seen Lynette at various locations since her disappearance in 1982.
So the defense's entire strategy, it rested on convincing the court that a reasonable possibility existed that Lynette was still alive, or at least that she had left voluntarily, and that would undermine the prosecution's claim that a murder had even taken place.
A significant procedural detail of the trial was that Chris Dawson chose not to give evidence.
Which is his absolute legal right.
It is. But it meant that Justice Harrison had to assess the credibility of all the evidence presented by the prosecution and the defense witnesses without hearing Dawson's own direct, sworn explanation for the events of January 1982.
So the moment of the verdict, it was massive, given the 4-decade wait for justice. Justice Harrison took 5 hours on August 30th, 2022, to meticulously deliver his detailed reasons for finding Chris Dawson guilty of murder.
And that comprehensive judgment was so necessary. He had to demonstrate exactly how the court reached the criminal standard of proof in the complete absence of a body.
One of the most important aspects of that judgment was Justice Harrison's definitive rejection of the defense's core hypothesis.
The abandonment theory.
Exactly. He found that the alleged sightings of Lynette, which the defense had used to suggest she had just left, were, quote, wholly unreliable.
Wholly unreliable. That's incredibly strong language from a judge.
It is. He systematically detailed why the witness memories, which were dating back 40 years, were compromised, and why their testimony was contradictory and couldn't be trusted.
And Justice Harrison concluded there was a most compelling body of evidence to completely reject the hypothesis that Lynette Dawson had chosen to abandon her daughters and her family.
He cited factors like her loving relationship with her children, which many witnesses attested to, her lack of communication with family members she was very close to, her lack of access to financial resources or any travel documents.
All the things you would need to start a new life.
All the things you would need. He basically said it was completely implausible. But beyond simply rejecting the defense's narrative, Justice Harrison established that Chris Dawson had actively and knowingly fabricated key aspects of his story to authorities.
And this is crucial, because identifying these deliberate falsehoods demonstrated what's known in the law as a consciousness of guilt.
Exactly. The judgment detailed 4 specific instances where Justice Harrison found Dawson had lied. These included, first, lying about the true nature and extent of his relationship with Joanne Curtis. He minimized the affair to police.
Second, lying about having any desire to resume a relationship with his wife after her disappearance. He tried to paint a picture of a man who wanted her back.
And third, and this is perhaps the most damning lie, was lying about receiving phone calls from Lynette after she had supposedly vanished.
Let's just dwell on those fabricated phone calls for a moment, because this was so critical to establishing that consciousness of guilt.
It really was.
Dawson claimed he received multiple phone calls from Lynette telling him she was safe and had just left for a bit. Justice Harrison found these claims were fabricated for 2 clear reasons.
What were they?
First, they provided an artificial explanation for why he didn't report her missing immediately. I wasn't worried, she was calling me. And second, they created a narrative that Lynette was alive and contacting him, which directed suspicion away from himself.
So the judge concluded these lies weren't just slips of memory after 40 years. They were deliberate, calculated attempts to mislead investigators from the very beginning.
And so, in his final conclusion, Justice Harrison stated that he was satisfied beyond reasonable doubt that Lynette Dawson died as a result of a conscious and voluntary act by Chris Dawson.
And that judicial determination confirmed it. The circumstantial evidence, meticulously assembled and analyzed over the course of that judge-alone trial, was strong enough to meet the criminal standard of proof for murder, even in a nobody case.
The legal consequences then followed that judicial determination of guilt. Chris Dawson was sentenced on December 2nd, 2022, to 24 years in jail.
A sentence reflecting the gravity and the premeditated nature of the crime, with an 18-year non-parole period.
But the legal scrutiny didn't stop with the sentencing. Dawson immediately lodged an appeal against his murder conviction.
But after years of complex litigation, his appeal was dismissed in June of 2024, confirming the original guilty verdict and marking a definitive legal resolution to this tragic, decades-long case.
You know, the Lynette Dawson case really stands as a landmark example in Australian criminal law. It serves as profound evidence that a murder conviction can be achieved and sustained through appeal in a case based entirely on circumstantial evidence.
Even without the discovery of the victim's body, a confession, or any direct forensic evidence.
Exactly. This outcome, it really underscores the tremendous resourcefulness and commitment required from prosecutors and cold case investigators.
Yeah.
They have to synthesize these disparate pieces of evidence, from domestic timeline details to conflicting witness testimony, into an irrefutable chain of guilt decades after the fact.
It demonstrates the capacity of the legal system to eventually overcome initial investigative shortcomings and pervasive legal hurdles.
He does.
You know, the source material consistently brought us back to one unique recurring factor in all of this, and that's the intense, almost shared identity between Chris and his twin brother, Paul Dawson.
It's always there in the background, isn't it?
It is. We noted their appearance on that 1975 documentary discussing how this relationship affected their marriages. And we noted the allegations concerning illicit sexual behavior against both brothers.
Given that source material highlighting the strong mutual bond and Paul's close proximity to Chris during that critical period in 1982.
You have to wonder, we might consider the broader influence of that twin relationship on the case's complexities. It's a specific familial facet that continues to invite scrutiny and reflection.
It reminds us that crimes rarely occur in a vacuum, in isolation, and that personal relationships, however unique they might be, can profoundly shape the circumstances surrounding an event, and just as importantly, its subsequent cover-up.
Indeed, the questions surrounding the potential involvement or the knowledge of those closest to Chris Dawson, those are facets that continue to resonate within the public consciousness, long after the final verdict has been delivered and upheld.
It's a reminder that accountability sometimes can take generations to achieve.
Thank you for joining us for this extensive analysis of the sources surrounding the murder of Lynette Dawson.
Thanks for listening.